All right, so there are two questions we ask about, are the Gospels reliable? So the first question we then have to ask is, are the Gospels that we have today what they had in the first century? Perhaps you've heard this objection before. Many people, when they object to the Gospels, they will say, well, we do not have the original documents of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In fact, we don't even have the copies of the original documents. They'll say something like, we have the copies of the copies of the copies. And so how can we trust that the Bible, and then those copies were translated into many different languages and then came to us today 2,000 years later? So the objection goes, how can we even trust that what we have written in our Bibles is actually even the same thing that the first gospel writers gave, that what they would have had in the first century? So we need to ask this question. Well, I will admit that we do not have the original documents. We do not have the original Matthew. We do not have the original Mark. We do not have the original Luke. We do not have the original John. And so the question is a good one. We don't have those. But does that really mean, just because we don't have the actual paper, or in that time it would have been the papyrus, the papyri that they wrote on, just because we don't have those, does that mean that the Gospels we have today don't at least represent what they had back then? So let's look at a couple things of evidence. First, textual evidence and transmission. What I would suggest to you is the amount of textual evidence that we have for the New Testament is unlike any other document from the ancient world. It is by far the most well-attested document from the first century. First off, we have approximately 5,700 Greek manuscripts. Now, those manuscripts vary from anything like a fragment. What you see actually here on the screen is a picture of the oldest fragment we have. It is known as P52. So P stands for papyrus, what it's written on. 52, it's the 52nd document that we recovered. So very technical how we label that. But that is P52. P52, at the latest, is around the turn of the first century, right? So around AD into the second century. So around AD 100 to AD 110 at the latest. Some even document this within the first century. Now, that's important. We'll talk about why that's important. But so those 5,700 manuscripts not only include fragments like this, but some of them include whole books and include whole letters. So we have some that include the whole New Testament. We also have, for more evidence, over 10,000 Latin Vulgate manuscripts. These are, as the New Testament was transmitted very early on, it began to be translated into Latin, and we have over 10,000 of those manuscripts. We also have 9,300 early versions of the New Testament written in either Syriac or Coptic or perhaps some other languages. This is all these early documents we have. So if you total that up, we have around, if you want to include both the Latin manuscripts, the Syriac, the Coptic manuscripts, we have around 25,000 manuscripts that are witnesses to the New Testament. We actually have 12 manuscripts dated to with 100 years of the original writing. So P52 is an example of this. Another one is P66, which is early second century, and there are some others as well. But 12 manuscripts dated within 100 years of the original writings. The earliest full copy we have of the New Testament is called Codex Sinaiticus. Codex Sinaiticus is dated to around AD 350. Now, a codex is basically like a book. It referred to, there was a leather cover, and then they would take the pages and they would put it in. They called this a codex. So the earliest full copy we have of the New Testament is to AD 350. Now, why is this significant? Let's compare it to the other ancient Greek manuscripts. So some examples here. Suetonius, a famous Roman historian, we have around 200 manuscripts dating no later than the 9th century. Now again, Suetonius is writing within right before the first century and 100 BC, all the way up into the first century. And for his writings, around the same time that the New Testament is written, we only have 200 of these manuscripts. And again, we have them about 900 years later. Okay, so let's look at another historian. We have Livy, again, writing around the same time. We have around 27 manuscripts. Okay, 27, so far less. We have some of them, though, a little bit earlier, but still, the earliest one dated to the 4th century. By the way, by the 4th century, we already have a full New Testament writing. We also have Tacitus. Tacitus, another famous Roman historian, the History and Annals. We have one copy of the Annals, which dates to about the 9th century, one copy of Annals 1 through 6, and then we have one copy of Annals 11 through 16 and Histories. Both of those date to around the 11th century. We also have Julius Caesar's Gallic Wars, very well-known historical document. We only have 10 copies, the earliest dated to 1,000 years after they were written. Let's go to the most well-attested document besides the New Testament, okay? So the second most well-attested document beside the New Testament from the ancient world is Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey. Okay, so how does Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey compare? Around 2,300 manuscripts. So about half of what we have, less than half of what we have in the New Testament. Again, 5,700 Greek manuscripts. We only have around 2,300 manuscripts. Again, that includes fragments, partial books. This, again, is a partial fragment from Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey. We also only have two fragments that date within 400 years of the original manuscript itself. Remember, if you go back, the New Testament, we have 12 that date to within 100 years of the writings of the New Testament. The earliest full copy of his work, you remember the earliest full copy of the New Testament we have is AD 350. The earliest full copy of Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey is around 1000 to 1100 AD. Okay, so we've established the New Testament. It's the most well-attested document in the ancient world. But does that mean then, okay, but it still doesn't answer the question. I have acknowledged to you that we have a lot of manuscripts that come from the early ancient world, but I also acknowledge to you that we don't have the original writings. We don't have the original Gospel of John, the original Gospel of Matthew, Luke, or Mark. So, if that is the case, can we know that those gospel fragments we have are representative of what the real gospels are, or are they really just copies of copies of copies? You see, some people will suggest that because we have copies of copies of copies, we're basically playing something akin to what we call the telephone game. I don't know if in Norway they play this game as a kid. Okay, so you know how the telephone game goes. You whisper a sentence in someone's ear. We could start over here, whisper a sentence in your ear. If we then whisper the sentence around everyone's ear, when it came to the end, we probably would get something really funny because either one, it's really hard to, even in that sentence, get it all right. And then as kids, sometimes you like to change it just because it's funny, right? So a lot of people accuse the New Testament writings as just something akin to the telephone game. But what I want to say is there is a difference between what we call translation and transmission. I'll explain. Translation is a little bit more like the telephone game. What is a telephone? It is one direct line of communication from one person to another. All right, if I get on my phone to call my wife, I am communicating directly to her. So most of the time it's one-on-one. This is what translation is. Thankfully you all speak English, but if my lecture had to be translated in Norwegian, it would be someone standing next to me, I would speak, and then that person would then, one line of communication, translate it to you. So this is what translation is, but that is not exactly what is happening with the New Testament and with what New Testament scholars do with the abundant manuscript evidence that we have. You see, transmission is like a puzzle. So we take 5,700 manuscripts with the abundance of New Testament manuscripts that we have, again, not even including the 10,000 Latin Vulgate manuscripts, not including the 9,300 Coptic and Syriac manuscripts, not including the multitudes of quotations of the New Testament from the early church fathers that are living around within the first few centuries of the New Testament being written, not including all of that. If we just take these 5,700 New Testament manuscripts, what scholars do when they determine what is the reading of the Gospels is they're not playing telephone, they're trying to put together a 1,000-piece puzzle with 1,100 pieces. Okay, so Would you rather have a 1,000-piece puzzle and only have 900 pieces? Or would you rather have a 1,000-piece puzzle with 1,100 pieces? Both are annoying to some extent, but I would rather have the puzzle with 1,100 pieces. Why? Because I know I have all the pieces I need to put together the picture that the puzzle is asking for. If I have 900, I can't put the whole puzzle together. That is what we have with the New Testament and with the manuscript evidence, and that is what we have with the Gospels. So, some final thoughts for you. The abundance of the New Testament evidence has led scholars to conclude that we can reconstruct the New Testament text to about 97 to 99% accuracy. This is across the board. Conservative scholars, liberal scholars, those who do the work in what we call in the field textual criticism, putting together the Gospels, putting together New Testament texts, will argue at the low end, we have about 97% accurate, and the high end, 99% accurate. Pretty significant, right? But what about the remaining 1 to 3%? The remaining 1 to 3% of uncertain texts have nothing to do with key doctrinal issues. Bergen is a famous New Testament critic who has studied this very well. By the way, does not believe in the historical reliability of the Gospels, but even Bergen, he was asked in the radio interview one time by a person, so if we have all these copies of copies, then what do the original Gospels say? Bergen asked the interviewer, confused, like, what do you mean? What do the original Gospel says? Well, if you're saying we don't have the original documents, all we have is copies, then what in the world do they say? And he even admits, well, they probably said about what we have today. Why? Because we have an abundance of textual evidence that makes us very confident that we are incredibly close to what the New Testament originally said, and even the variations are not on major doctrinal, orthodox issues of Christian belief. Okay, so going back to our question, can we be confident that the Gospels that we have today are what they had back in the first century? The answer, I would suggest, is yes. Okay, so this is the first part of the question of are the Gospels reliable? Now you can say, James, I accept, maybe let's just say I even accept your premise that the Gospels that we have today are what they had back then. What I haven't necessarily proven to you is, are they actually true? You see, there's a difference between having the actual Gospels and being confident that we had what they had back then. Great, we've got that down. But it doesn't necessarily mean they're true. I can have the original copy of Beowulf and know exactly what Beowulf says, but it doesn't make the story of Beowulf true. So that brings us to our second question. Do the Gospels give a reliable account of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus? So we might have them, but are they historically reliable? Do they give a good account of who Jesus was, of his death, and his resurrection? I want to look at a few lines of evidence. First, let's look at the sources and the witnesses of the gospel. One of the key texts for any historical reliability of any account is multiple independent sources. The same is going to be true. You are in law school here. If you're going to have a case, examine a case, one important thing of proving a case is having multiple witnesses, especially if we have a criminal case. If you have a criminal case, what do you need to prove your case? You need multiple witnesses to the crime. So the same is true when we're looking at historical reliability. We need multiple witnesses. So what do we have? We have 4 gospel accounts of Jesus' life. The fact that we have 4 accounts does not point to the fact that they're historically unreliable, as some have suggested. Some have suggested, why don't we just have 1? Why do we have 4? And these 4, and then they'll look at potential contradictions and stuff, and they'll argue, okay, the fact that we have to have 4 different ones proves that they're not reliable. Well, no, I would argue the opposite. If we want to be really sure that Jesus' life, his death, his resurrection is historically reliable, we need multiple witnesses. So the fact that we have 4 actually proves their veracity. Paul himself is a witness to it. Paul, existing in the early first century, in 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 6, he talks about the resurrection. He talks about seeing Jesus on the road to Damascus, but he also talks about Jesus appearing before Peter after he rose from the dead, Jesus appearing before 500 others, and Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15 that many of them are still alive. He is an independent witness to the gospel account of Jesus' death and resurrection. The gospel writers, they mention eyewitnesses in Jesus' life who would have been alive at the time of their writing. I'll give a couple examples. Mark mentions on Jesus' crucifixion when he's walking and he's taking the cross, carrying it to the top of the hill. He mentions a man by the name of Simon of Cyrene, who was pulled out of the crowd to help Jesus carry the cross. But he doesn't just mention this is Simon, he's from Cyrene, but he also mentions that Simon is the father of Alexander and Rufus. Now, Alexander and Rufus at this time, Mark being written in the first century, Alexander and Rufus were certainly still alive. Why does Mark mention them? He mentions them because you can go to Simon or you can go to his sons, Alexander and Rufus, and they will affirm to you what I am telling you. Luke claims to compile his gospel from eyewitness accounts. He says in Luke 1 through 4, inasmuch as many have undertaken to compile a narrative of the things that have been accomplished among us, just as those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us. It seemed good to me also, having followed all things closely for some time past, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus. What does Luke mention here? He mentions there are people who have been witnesses, who've witnessed the events that I'm going to write about. And so Luke was very concerned in his own gospel putting together eyewitness accounts. The Gospels were all also written within the first century, giving them close proximity to the events of the life of Jesus. Even the most liberal scholars will tell you that every gospel was written in the first century. The latest that some will suggest will be after AD 70. I think, and I don't have time to enumerate this argument right now, I believe there's very good evidence, and many would argue there's great evidence that all of these gospels, at least the first three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, were all written before AD 70, giving them close proximity to the events that happened in the Gospels, which happened around somewhere between AD 28 to AD 30 or AD 30 to AD 33. Okay, so we have sources, witnesses to the Gospel. We also have incredible historical details within the Gospels. The Gospels themselves resemble the conventional ancient biographies of the day. Now, it's important when you go to read the Gospels that you don't read them like you would read a biography written now. Biographies written now are often written with, we start when someone's born, and then we chronologically go through their life. We might even talk about their childhood, we talk about their whatever famous figure they are, we talk about their significant careers, the significant events in their life, and then we move all the way to their death. This is not how ancient biographies worked. And there's many studies done on this and how biographies were written during that world, but most scholars will agree that the Gospels represent the conventional Greco-Roman biographies of the day, written by a guy like Plutarch, who was one of the most famous biographers during that time. And so we need to read them that way. And what the ancient biographies did was, rather than focus on someone's life from birth until death, although all the Gospels mention Jesus' death, and 2 of the Gospels mention his birth, they focused on significant deeds and speeches of a person to portray the essence of who they were and what they did. So the Gospel writers are focused on significant events and significant speeches or words that Jesus spoke in order to portray who he was. Ancient biographies, they would make extensive use of many things that perhaps we in modern day would not think are used in biography, but they would do stuff like paraphrase. They're grabbing the essence of what someone is saying. They would maybe not focusing so much word for word on what was spoken by the speaker, but paraphrasing it. They would simplify stories. That is, they would omit certain details because they weren't relevant to the story. They wouldn't arrange things in chronological order. So the Gospels are not meant to give me a chronological account of Jesus' life. They would take significant stories and they would put them together, but they would put them together to at least give an accurate picture of who Jesus was and what he did. Now again, this was an accepted practice during that time, and it doesn't mean just because that they did not do biography the way we did biography, it does not mean that their biographies were untrue. And it also doesn't mean they weren't concerned about history. I'll show some other things of the historical reliability of these Gospels. 2, the details that align with historical realities in the ancient world. I'll just give a couple. 1, popular names in the ancient world. So, think about it today. So, popular name in the U.S. Is James. James is still a very popular name in the U.S. When I went to college, I went to a pretty small school, but we still had several guys on campus named James. So they couldn't call us all James, or else we didn't know who you were talking about. So we would often be given qualifiers. For me, they sometimes would call me by my last name, Crockett. They would call me by my middle name, Prather. And then other guys, they would give them what we would call qualifiers to distinguish which James we're talking about. Now, why did I bring this up? This is very true of also something that happened in the ancient world, of popular names. And popular names are given, the technical term would be called disambiguators. That is, we are distinguishing between which person is which. So, I have a chart of the most popular names in the ancient world. I won't go through this in detail, but you can kind of see here the top 11 names. We have Simon, Joseph, Lazarus, Judas, John, Jesus, Ananias, Jonathan, Matthew, Manaen, and James. These are the most popular names. This was a study done, by the way, by a Jewish historian very recently. He went through and he studied all of these names, and this is what he came up with. Tal Elan is the Jewish historian, in case you want to know, who came up with this study, examining all of these ancient Jewish documents around from, I believe, there you go, the date's up there, 330 BC to 8200. Now, why do I bring this chart up? Let's go to Matthew chapter 10, verse 2 through 4. I want you to notice something. So Matthew is naming off the apostles. And this is not the only instance where this happens, but this does happen here. The names of the 12 apostles are these. First, Simon. Simon is number 1 on the list, the most common name in the ancient world. What is Simon called in Matthew 10? Who is called Peter? He gives a disambiguator, all right? This is the Simon that we're talking about. He's the one who is called Peter. By the way, as another aside, 1 Corinthians 15, when Paul talks about the resurrection of Jesus, it says he first appeared to Cephas. Why? Because he's distinguishing from Simon, right? Because Simon was a very popular name. You would have had to say which Simon it is. You also have Andrew's brother, James, number 11 on the list, the son of Zebedee. So we're distinguishing the son of Zebedee. John, number 5 on the list. That's James's brother, okay? This is this John. Philip and Bartholomew. Now you know this. There's not a qualifier attached to their names. Why? Philip was a Greek name, and so was Bartholomew. They were the 61st and 50th popular names during that time in the ancient world, so there's no need to give them a nickname because Philip and Bartholomew are not very popular names. We have Thomas and Matthew, okay? Matthew, number 9. And so what do we have to do? We have to qualify him. He is the tax collector. James again, okay, the son of Alphaeus. Thaddeus, number 39. We don't necessarily need to qualify him. That's not a popular name. Simon, okay, the number 1 name, the Zealot. So we've again had a disambiguator. And then Judas, number 3, we say Iscariot, the one who betrayed him. What does this tell us? This tells us that these are closely aligned. These Gospels are closely aligned with the time, that they are historical, and that they are concerned about detail, and they match the historical detail that would have occurred during that time. Okay, that's not the only thing, though. That's one test of popularity, of historical reliability. There's another one. The person and places mentioned in the Gospels are verifiable. Again, I can't go through every example, but let me give you another example. Luke 3, verse 1 through 3. In the 15th year, so Luke is setting his story in the historical context of the time, so his readers would know when this happened in history. Again, it is not true that the gospel writers are not concerned about historical detail. They are. Luke 3, 1 through 3, in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar. Tiberius Caesar, he was the Roman emperor from AD 14 through 37, which would have been during the life of Jesus, which would have been the time of the story of Luke 3. Pontius Pilate, we know he was a Roman governor from AD 26 to 27 or 236 to 37. He is the governor of Judah during this time. He'll come up later as the one who crucifies Jesus. Herod, being the tetrarch of Galilee. Herod, tetrarch of Galilee, from history we know, he reigned from about 4 BC to AD 39. And his brother Philip, the tetrarch of the region of Iturea and Trachonitis. Well, we know that Philip reigned during this time from about 26 BC to AD 34. And Lysanias, the tetrarch of Abilene. He reigned from AD 14 through 29. He would have been the ruler at this time during the high priesthood of Annas and Caiaphas. They would have ruled from between 26 BC as high priest to AD 34. And the word of God came to John, the son of Zechariah, in the wilderness. These persons and places mentioned by Luke, and again, this is just one example. This happens throughout the Gospels, that the persons and places mentioned are verifiable persons and places that would have been there during the life of Jesus. So they are actually giving us history. There's also details that are characteristic of eyewitness and recollective memory. Okay, so what do I mean by that? Recollective memory tends to fix on unique and consequential events, but they then seem to retain irrelevant details. That is, they will give you details to that event that don't seem all that relevant to the story. If you ever experienced this, maybe you have a friend, or perhaps sometimes my wife tells me a story about something that happened during that day, and oftentimes she'll give me details that didn't really matter to the overall story. In fact, sometimes she'll say, oh, I'm rambling a bit. So the main part of the story is this, right? I could do the same thing. I could tell you when I flew into Norway, I can give you a story of I was delayed in coming from Amsterdam to Bergen. What I remember about that is I also was getting hot and I had to take my sweater off. Well, that memory, that detail doesn't really matter to whether I was late to getting to Bergen. Right? What matters is I was late to getting to Bergen, and I can tell you why I was late getting to Bergen, but the idea that I took my sweater off doesn't really matter to the story. This type of stuff happens in the Gospels, and it's evidence of people not just making something up, but it's evidence that they're recalling a certain event. I'll give you a couple examples. In Mark 4:38, Mark mentions that Jesus was asleep on a cushion in the stern of the boat. Now, Mark 4 is the story of Jesus calming the storm on the seas. It tells that they're in the seas, Jesus goes, and he's asleep, and the storm comes. The disciples are very afraid, and they wake him up. Jesus, why don't you calm the storm? Now, Mark, if he's just making this up, maybe he might mention that Jesus is asleep. But why mention that Jesus is asleep on the stern, in the cushion, in the boat? All right? It's an irrelevant detail, but it is evidence that he's recalling something to mind. Or in Mark's case, we have early ancient evidence that his source is Peter, who would have been with Jesus, and Peter might recall an irrelevant detail such as this. John, in his gospel, in John 21, 8 through 11, he mentions when the resurrected Jesus appears to them, he gives two irrelevant details. He talks about the disciples are in a boat when Jesus calls to them, and he says we were about 100 yards off. Why does that matter to the story? Jesus is calling to them, and they're in a boat. How far they were from the shore is not really a relevant detail. But then he also mentions they came and they had a net full of fish that they caught. That Jesus, when he tells them to cast the net into the sea, they pull up fish and their nets were full. Now, he could have ended there, but then John just decides to throw in, there were 153 fish, exactly. Now, if you were making up a story, it seems pretty arbitrary to just make up, well, there were 153 fish. You would just say, oh, the nets were full. Such details tell us that that at least suggest to us they're recalling something they actually saw. Okay? We also have another thing. This is called undesigned coincidences. Okay, I've put the definition up there if you've not heard this term, undesigned coincidences. It occurs when an account of an event leaves out information which is filled in, often incidentally, by another account of the same event. Such information often answers questions that arise from the former account of the event. Okay, I'll give you an example before I give an example from the Gospels. So perhaps you're in a court case, you're in a criminal trial, and you're talking about someone who robbed a house, and you've got two witnesses on the stand that talk about this robbery. The first witness talks about he saw the man run out of the house, and the man tripped and fell, and he got up and he kept going. Okay, the second witness says, I saw the man run out of the house. He doesn't mention the man tripped and fell and kept going. He just says, I saw the man run out of the house and his shoes were untied. Now, put those two stories together, what happens? The first witness, when he says he fell out of the house, he tripped and fell, you might ask, why did he trip and fall? The second witness doesn't mention that he tripped and fell, but he does mention his shoes are untied, which answers the question from the first witness. Why did the man trip and fall? Because his shoes were untied. Okay, and so each one is not giving you the exact same detail, but when you put their stories together, their stories make sense. Okay, so this happens in the Gospels. I'll give you one example. John 6, we have the feeding of the 5,000. The people out there, they're listening to Jesus teach. It's getting late in the day. The people are getting hungry. And Jesus looks around and he asks Philip here, it says, lifting up his eyes then and seeing that a large crowd was coming toward him, Jesus said to Philip, where are we to buy bread so that these people may eat? Now this is interesting. The question comes, why does Jesus, of all the 12 disciples, ask Philip where to buy bread? You know, Matthew's the tax collector. He's the one that probably keeps the numbers. Judas is the one, we find out later, he's the one that holds the money. Why doesn't he ask these guys? The guy that's maybe accounting for the numbers, how much bread they would need to buy. Why doesn't he ask Judas, who's got the money? He asks Philip. The text doesn't answer that for us, but let's go to another gospel. Let's go actually earlier in John. John 1:44, we read that Philip was from Bethsaida. Okay, John 12:21, we also read, these came to Philip, who was from, not Bethesda, Bethsaida. Okay, so earlier in John, we realized that Philip is from Bethsaida. So track with me here. Jesus asked Philip, where are we going to buy bread? We read earlier in John, that Philip is from Bethsaida. Well, then in Luke, completely different gospel, talks about the same event. Luke does not mention that Jesus asked Philip where to buy bread, but Luke just mentions, on their return, the apostles told him all that they had done, and he took them and withdrew apart to a town called Bethsaida. So now we know that the feeding of the 5,000 at least occurs in the region of Bethsaida. You put the stories together, why does Jesus ask Philip to buy bread? It's because Philip was from Bethsaida. It would know where to go to buy the bread. Now again, these are incidental events, things that perhaps we don't need to mention, but it does give us evidence that, again, these are not stories that are being made up. And that actually, when you take the stories together, it actually suggests their truthfulness. Okay, so those are some historical details. A couple more things, and then we'll be done. The last thing I'll mention about the reliability of the Gospels is the embarrassment and the counterproductivity of the Gospels. If the Gospels were simply to gain political power, the Gospels if that's the only goal, if they made these stories up because they wanted to gain political power and influence in the ancient world, there are many things in the Gospels that would seemingly be counterproductive to their plan to gain power. I'll point out a couple things. One, the resurrected Jesus first appears in every account of his resurrection. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, he first appears to women. Now, in the ancient world, women were considered less reliable witnesses. They wouldn't be called to court because they wouldn't have been considered a reliable witness just because they were women. So if you were making this story up in the ancient world and you were making it up and you wanted to give your story credibility, you would not seemingly say that women were the first to witness his resurrection. You would perhaps mention the men. You mention the disciples were the first ones to do it, but the Gospels don't do that. This seems counterproductive. Why would they put that? Unless he actually did appear to the women first. And like she actually did raise from the dead, and that's who he went to first. The Gospels often paint a negative portrait of the apostles, the leaders of the early Christian movement. So, if you're telling a story of Jesus, you're telling a story with the apostles in it, Peter, James, John, all these guys, you would think that these guys would be painted as heroes. Look at how great these men were from early on. Jesus picked the best of the best if you wanted to gain power. Well, if you actually look at how the disciples are painted in the Gospels, they're actually depicted pretty negatively on multiple accounts. The disciples, they constantly argue amongst themselves. You read this in multiple accounts of the Gospels. Matthew 9, 33 through 37, Matthew 20, verse 20 through 28, Luke 22, 24 through 30. They're arguing over who's the greatest. They argue, they bicker with each other. The disciples, they have constant misunderstandings of Jesus. In fact, you'll see times Jesus almost get frustrated with the disciples. How many times do I have to tell you this? There's a funny story where Jesus talks about beware of the leaven of the Pharisees. And Jesus is using a metaphor to say, beware of the false teaching of the things that the Pharisees put into the Old Testament that should not be there. And it says the disciples then discuss among themselves about where they're going to buy bread. In other words, they completely miss Jesus' metaphor. And Jesus basically then gets onto them and says, this is a metaphor. You completely missed it. All right, so the disciples, they constantly misunderstand him. They're cowardly. In Jesus' most important time of need, when he's in the garden, when he's arrested, what do the disciples do? They run away. They are not brave in the Jesus moment of peril. They are cowards. Peter himself, one of the pillars of the early church, denies Jesus 3 times in Jesus' most important hour of need. He doesn't fight. He is a coward, and he denies Jesus 3 times. Thomas initially doubted the resurrection of Jesus. It says he doesn't believe that happened, even though Jesus, by the way, multiple times in the gospel tells him, I'm going to rise again. Thomas doesn't believe it. So, again, if we think that the gospel writers would make this up, we would think they would paint the disciples well. But in fact, they often don't. Why don't they? Because it actually happened the way they said it happened. The last thing, the idea that the central figure of Christianity suffered a shameful death by crucifixion would have been a difficult thing for many in the ancient world to accept. So if you just want to start a religious political movement during that time, making the central figure of your movement someone who died on a Roman cross would have been perhaps one of the worst ways you could go. 1 Corinthians 1:23, Paul says, we preach Christ crucified. And then he mentions this. It's a stumbling block to the Jews, and it's folly to Gentiles. Why? For the Jew, the idea of a Messiah dying on a cross was not the picture they have of a Jew. The picture they had of the Messiah. They expected the Messiah to come and to overthrow the Roman government. So for you to then argue to your fellow Jewish brother, no, the actual Messiah is one who was crucified by the Romans, not someone who overthrew the Romans. It's a stumbling block to them. It's not how they pictured it. And it's foolish to Gentiles. Why? Because crucifixion was the most shameful form of death there was. And the Greeks really loved their heroes, and they aggrandized their heroes. They celebrated their ancient heroes. And so for you to tell a Greek, hey, the central figure of our movement is one who suffered and was the most shameful death that you could have in the ancient world, the Greeks think it's foolish. How in the world could that be? So why is this the center of the story, that Jesus died by crucifixion on a Roman cross? Well, it's the center of the story because he rose again. And why is it the center of the story? Unless it's the gospel witnesses, it actually happened. It's actually something that they saw. So we've examined 2 important questions on the historical reliability of the Gospels. One, are the Gospels that we have today what they had in the first century? We said, yes, they are. We can be confident. But perhaps the bigger question, do the Gospels give an account of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus? The weight of the evidence would lead me and many others who choose to follow Jesus to say, yes. Returning to our initial question from Pilate, what is truth? Well, if these Gospels are a reliable account of what happened, and Jesus is who he said he was, he did live, he did die, and he did rise again. Then I don't know about you, but one who has risen from the dead to never die again might have greater authority to determine what is true more than anyone else. Thank you.